I want to start by thanking my friend and colleague from Rhode Island for pointing out why we have a jury system, a system of our peers who can listen to all sides of an argument in a fair way and render justice. And what this resolution does is prohibits many consumers around the country from having the choice of going before a jury as part of a group of people who have been wronged. So, Mr. President, for months, the American people have been hearing stories of how big banks, big financial institutions have engaged in various schemes that harmed consumers and cheated consumers out of millions and millions of dollars. The most notorious recently, of course, was the case of Wells Fargo, which opened up a lot of fake accounts, meaning they opened accounts without consumers asking them to open accounts and then charged those consumers for those accounts. And it's a fact that Wells Fargo, in many cases, tried to use forced arbitration to prevent those people who've been wronged from getting access to justice, from being compensated for their harm. We also heard about the Equifax case. Equifax is a credit reporting agency. They collect gobs of information on all of us, on over 170 million Americans, without our permission. We don't say, Equifax, hey, go out and dig up as much information about us as you can and put it on your computer system. They go out and do it. And then we all know that they were subjected to a hack, a massive hack. And that very confidential, highly personal information on over 100 million Americans has now been compromised. And one of the things Equifax did after that is they said to consumers, you know what? We know that your information may have been compromised because of this hack on our system. And we want to help protect you. But if you want our protection, you've got to sign away your rights to be part of a class action lawsuit against us. That was their original plan and their original instinct. Well, there was a big public outcry about that, and they backed off. But the former CEO of Equifax in the banking committee hearing just a few weeks ago said they backed off in response to the public outcry, but if they had done business as usual, they would have prevented those consumers from getting compensation for wrongs through the court system. And even after we hear about Equifax and that scandal and the Wells Fargo banking scandal, we are here on the floor of the United States Senate not to help even the playing field for consumers, but to take away a right that consumers now have to help even the playing field against these big banks and financial institutions. It's entirely backwards. Mr. President, I just want to read from the statement that was issued by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, on July 10th of this year when they issued their new rule. Here was the headline: CFPB issues rule to ban companies from using arbitration clauses to deny groups of people their day in court. Simple as that. Went on to say financial companies can no longer block consumers from joining together to sue over wrongdoing. And it pointed out that companies use mandatory arbitration clauses to deny groups of people their day in court. They went on to say many consumer financial products like credit cards and bank accounts have arbitration clauses in their contracts that prevent consumers from joining together to sue their bank or financial company for wrongdoing. And that's right. We all know that in the fine print of a lot of credit card applications, in the fine print that consumers get from a lot of big financial institutions, fine print of auto loans, there are buried these provisions that compel those consumers to give up their rights. This is not a question, I've heard conversation on the floor, this is not a question about whether arbitration in and of itself is a good or bad way to resolve disputes. If I've been wronged or you've been wronged and you agree voluntarily to enter into an arbitration dispute mechanism, fine, do it voluntarily. That's not what this is about. It's not what it's about at all. This is about forcing arbitration. We listen to the CEO of Wells Fargo. We listen to the former CEO of Equifax. They all say they value their consumers. They want to make sure that they do right by their consumers. But it turns out they don't trust their consumers at all because they want to take away from those same consumers the right to seek justice through the court system if that's what those consumers choose to do. And that's exactly why the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau took the action it did, to protect consumers, to make sure that they could not be compelled into arbitration. If they chose it after they had been wronged, that's their decision. But this is about mandatory arbitration and forcing consumers to give up their rights. Mr. President, we've heard a lot about the Washington swamp. This resolution to overturn this consumer protection provision is the Washington swamp at its muckiest and at its smelliest. Now, I have here a letter I received today from the American Legion, people who have represented men and women who have served our country. Here's what it says. This is from the legislative director at the American Legion. Dear friends and colleagues, I write to reiterate the American Legion's strong support for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau arbitration rule in light of reports that the Senate could vote on the matter as early as this evening. The alarm bells went up, the American Legion and other places. You may recall that I emailed you about this on October 2nd. That email is below, but today I want to share a couple of additional points. Point number one, in bold, a vote to overturn the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau arbitration rule is a vote against our military and veterans. That's from the American Legion. Mr. President, I want to read some of the other veterans organizations that are against this action that the Senate is headed toward tonight. Blue Star Families, Military Order of the Purple Heart, the National Guard Association of the United States, National Military Families Association, Reserve Officers Association, and the list goes on, and they're joined by consumer protection groups. Here's what the American Legion said in their October letter to every member of the United States Senate. It says that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's rule on arbitration agreements addresses the widespread harm of forced arbitration by restoring the ability of service members, veterans, and other consumers to join together and seek release in class action lawsuits when financial institutions break the law. The American Legion summed it up just perfectly here. They pointed out that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau put forward a rule that said that veterans who have been wronged or cheated can join together to seek justice in the court system, and that other consumer groups can as well. I've heard a lot of talk today about people saying, you know what, we actually passed this law a little while ago that will protect service members, that will allow service members to band together to seek justice. Well, I got 2 points. One, the American Legion and all these vets groups, I don't think that was good enough. And they're appalled at what the Senate is thinking about doing tonight. The second question is, yes, we should protect our veterans, but why shouldn't we also be protecting all the other consumers around the United States of America? Why shouldn't they be able to seek justice? Why should they be compelled to go to arbitration when they would rather choose to go through the court system? We've heard fellow members talk about why the deck is stacked against individuals. Just think about it. You get cheated by your bank. Maybe it's $100, maybe it's $500. You get on the phone, and you know you're put on there forever. You're put on hold, you're put on hold, you finally get through, you get somebody, they maybe pass you to somebody else, maybe you get dropped in the process. But at the end of the day, in order for you to get your money back when they've been wronged, under this provision, the old provision, you'd have to go to arbitration and you'd have to shell out a lot of money. And the big banks know that. So what they fear is that all of us as consumers who have been cheated, that we have a chance to get together. It's class action. It's when everyone who's been wrong can get together and actually have a little bit of power and leverage against a big bank, whether it's Wells Fargo or Equifax, whatever it may be. That's the whole idea of a class action. People get to band together. And that's what the American Legion is asking the Senate to do, is to let veterans band together, but also just to let American consumers band together to seek justice. And Mr. President, I want to share with the Senate a story about one of my Maryland constituents and what happened to one of my Maryland constituents, because I think a lot of people can relate. This is a pretty extraordinary story, but they can relate to how one individual feels like they're fighting against a big organization. And this was a story that was reported on NPR, and the Maryland constituent's name is Michael Pfeiffer. And here's what happened. One morning in February, Michael Pfeiffer was heading off to his job in Maryland at a company that builds guitars. He walked to the spot where he'd parked his car. His car wasn't there. And so he called the police. He said, "I was livid. I thought someone stole my car." Well, somebody had made off with Pfeiffer's car, but it wasn't a car thief. It was Wells Fargo Bank. The police informed him of this when he called them up. And Michael Pfeiffer says, "That's when I found out my car was repossessed." Now, he had no idea why Wells Fargo wanted to repossess his car. He says his payments were automatically taken out of his checking account, his car payments. So he calls Wells Fargo and he finds out that the bank had put another insurance policy on his car. Lenders sometimes do this when a borrower doesn't have insurance. Wells Fargo calls it collateral protection insurance, CPI. Now, sometimes there's nothing wrong with that, but Wells Fargo imposed this insurance on nearly 500,000 people who already had bought insurance. They were already covered. Wells Fargo just decided to put another insurance plan on them, and guess what? Started charging them for it. So that's why right after Pfeiffer's car got repossessed, Wells Fargo tells him that he had been marked delinquent for not paying his insurance. Now this, again, was insurance he didn't want and he didn't need. Well, they said, "Too bad, you owe us $1,500. Now, Michael Pfeiffer then showed up at the bank with his bank statements. He showed all the payments he'd made for the vehicle. He showed proof of insurance showing that he never had a lapse in his insurance. And he says the people at the bank said, "Well, you shouldn't know anything. This is not your fault." He says they were just as confused as I was. Well, then he said the branch employees tried to be helpful. They called up Wells Fargo department that dealt with the details of car repossessions to find out what was going on. And they kept putting them on hold. So this is the Wells Fargo department putting their own Wells Fargo's branch folks on hold. He was there 2.5 hours, and it turns out they told him to call back a couple days later. Well, he called back a couple days later, said there was no prior record of his calls to the bank. He says they were very rude to him. Then, while he's arguing with the bank, they say, we've repossessed your car. If you don't pay us $600, we're going to sell it off. So he pays them $600. Then he finds out that he wasn't alone and that Wells Fargo had also engaged in this scheme to sell people car insurance as part of their car loans when they already had insurance. So, Mr. President, this is a very simple issue. The issue is whether or not consumers who have been wronged by big banks or other financial institutions, whether they can choose to band together with others to seek justice. And what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau did was say, consumers have that right. They have the right to choose how to go about getting justice. And what this Senate resolution does is take that right away from consumers and say, if you want to seek justice, you can only go through forced arbitration, where we know the deck is stacked against the lonely consumer and stacked in favor of the big banks and the big financial institutions. Let's not do that, Mr. President. Let's vote down this resolution. Let's protect the consumer protections that are in place today.